right, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us. Just a couple announcements as we get started. This webinar is being recorded, and the recording plus the slides that will be used today, as well as a written summary, will be posted on our website at www.naruc.org/lab within a couple weeks. We will also have time for a question and answer session at the end, so please save your questions until then. There are 3 ways to submit questions. You can either raise your hand in the GoToWebinar app, you can submit your question in the chat box, or you can email it to me, and my email will be on the final slide. So with that, I'd like for Commissioner Oden to go ahead and say a few words about our Clean Coal Subcommittee. Commissioner, I've unmuted you, so you should be able to speak. Commissioner Oden? All right, I think we may have lost Commissioner Oden, so we'll just go ahead and get started with Doug Scott from the Great Plains Institute.
Well, thanks very much, Kara. Hope you can all hear me very well. My name is Doug Scott. I'm Vice President for Strategic Initiatives at the Great Plains Institute. We're a not-for-profit that does energy and environmental policy work based in Minneapolis, and I'm a former commissioner with the Illinois Commission. So it's good to be talking to NARUC. Appreciate Kara and NARUC and Chair Oden and the opportunity to be with you today, and also appreciate the work that the subcommittee is doing on clean coal. And at Great Plains Institute, we do a lot of work on carbon capture, and we are ready to help the subcommittee any way that we can. So if you think of other ways that we may be able to be helpful to NARUC or to the subcommittee, please let us know. Today, we're also being joined by my colleague, Brad Crabtree, also a vice president with the Great Plains Institute. And Brad, for many, many years, has been doing a lot of work on carbon capture issues, including enhanced oil recovery. And in fact, Brad was one of the founders and still helps facilitate and run the National Enhanced Oil Recovery Institute, which is a group of a large stakeholder group involving utilities, coal companies, not-for-profits, NGOs, government officials, who are all looking at trying to design federal policy that would benefit carbon capture technology. And so Brad is here to answer questions if folks have them during the course of the webinar. Next slide, please, Kara. Thank you. So what we're going to do today, we've got 4 basic pieces of this presentation, and we're going to leave lots of time for questions at the end. I'm going to start off doing background on the state CO2 EOR deployment work group, how that came to be. And then we're going to be joined by 3 different representatives from 3 different states. I'll introduce them all at the beginning here, and then each one of them will take their piece in the program as it comes up. Dan Lloyd from Montana is going to talk about the state's carbon capture incentive recommendations. There's a report that the state work group has done on that we'll talk about in a while. Dan was appointed by Montana Governor Steve Bullock in 2013 to serve as a business development specialist and policy advisor in the Governor's Office of Economic Development. Prior to joining the governor's staff, Dan worked for the Montana Department of Commerce, focused on energy development, managed projects for an energy-related publishing and training firm, and worked as an independent contractor serving the medical device industry. Then we're going to talk about a second report that the group has done on state CO2 pipeline infrastructure recommendations. And that part of the discussion will be led by Matt Fry, who is a policy advisor to Wyoming Governor Matt Mead. Matt has worked in the natural resource field for approximately 20 years in both the public and private sectors. He's worked for a number of fish and wildlife management agencies, as well as an environmental professional in the manufacturing and transportation fields. And both Matt and Dan have been, because they're governors, Governor Mead in Wyoming and Governor Bullock in Montana, were the 2 governors who convened the state working group originally. Matt and Dan have also served a very important role in helping to be co-conveners of the state working group. And finally, the next steps for the working group and some other observations about the working group itself and why the work that it's doing is important. That'll be led by Sean Sheridan. Sean serves as the General Counsel for the Public Service Commission in the state of Mississippi. The General Counsel heads the legal division of the Public Service Commission and assists and advises in all manners affecting the powers and duties of the PSC, offering legal and policy advice, conducting investigations, serving as a hearing examiner upon appointment, and oversees legal and policy activity involving the PSC in both state and federal forums. Sean has been with the PSC since October of 2010, and for all of us who have PUC work, either currently or in our past, we know how important the General Counsel is, and Sean has also worked with us on another project that we at Great Plains Institute facilitate of energy and environmental regulators in the MISO footprint as well. So we really appreciate everybody being with us today. And if we go to the next slide, I'll talk for just a couple of minutes about the background for the state working group and how it got started. Since I mentioned that I was a prior government official, PUC official in Illinois, and so from the time that the National Enhanced Oil Recovery Initiative started, I was a part of that group back then. That group has been working on federal tax credits and other support to lower the upfront costs of carbon capture and enhanced oil recovery. And what we've been seeing is a number of states and governors, legislators, utility commissioners have signaled some growing support for federal and state policies to help out with carbon capture and CO2 enhanced oil recovery. And the three that are mentioned on this slide, in 2015, the Western Governors Association passed a resolution which supported both the federal 45Q tax credit initiative that's currently going on, and with a bill recently introduced in the United States Senate, or soon to be introduced in the United States Senate, that would provide for some 45Q tax credit for CO2 EOR projects. So the Western Governors Association passed that resolution in 2015, as did the Southern States Energy Board, emphasizing the need for federal incentives and state policy measures. And then NARUC in 2016, which we greatly appreciate, passed a resolution that built on an earlier NARUC resolution, which highlighted a lot of the economic energy production and carbon mitigation benefits for CO2 EOR, and also the importance of state and federal action. And that's a current resolution that's now part of the NARUC system. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned earlier, Governors Meade and Bullock in the third quarter of 2015 formed the State CO2 EOR Deployment Work Group. You can see from the map that there are 14 states that are participating in it. Those are the states that are in green on your map. And you know, we should mention that different states, as is true of any kind of multi-state group, we have participation from different personnel in the states, and the participation varies depending on the state in terms of the frequency and the type of participation as well. I should also say that there are efforts made to bring more states onto this state working group. In fact, there are at least 2 more states that may be joining in very shortly with that. And if you think this is something in your particular state that would be of interest to you after you hear the rest of the webinar today, please let us know, and we'd be happy to accommodate you being part of this group. So what the state working group does is brings together the officials from the 14 states. The officials are the folks that actually vote on things. So when you see a report or you see some work product that comes from this group, that's actually voted on by the state officials. However, there is leading industry and NGO stakeholders and others who support this project and help to provide information to the state working group officials as well. We've had 7 meetings to date, reviewing modeling results, developing and agreeing on recommendations, and finalizing reports, letters, and other work products. And as it says there, this is funded by the Hewlett Foundation. Most of the work that Great Plains Institute does is funded by private foundations, and Hewlett is one of the major funders that does a lot of work on the carbon capture side of our operations. Next slide, please. So I won't read these to you, but these are the objectives for the work group. And basically what it's trying to do is provide greater awareness for these issues surrounding carbon capture and enhanced oil recovery, and also, helping stakeholders and policymakers, whether at the federal or state level, not only better understand the issues, but point out what some of the possibilities are for them to support these particular projects, make recommendations to them, and help them, in terms of implementing their strategies developed through the work group analysis. So there are a lot of things, looking at the reports, which we'll go into in just a bit. There are a lot of different initiatives that state and federal governments could take to help out with carbon capture projects, and the main goal of the state working group is to help both state and federal officials better understand what those different policy possibilities would be, and how they would help CO2 EOR if they were enacted. Next slide, please. This was the case for federal and state support for CO2 EOR. This was something that has been presented to NARUC before, and to the subcommittee actually before. It's something that the subcommittee probably knows very well. It could be its own webinar. Of course, a lot could go into a lot of different aspects of this, but in short, there are a lot of good reasons to support CO2 EOR from an energy, environmental, economic security standpoint, from a job standpoint, and from a standpoint of reducing emissions and providing some better energy security as well. So next slide, please. And, continuing that on this issue, being able to use more domestically produced oil, and taking something CO2, which in many contexts is something that's thought of as a liability, being able to use that as a commodity that would then benefit the existing oil fields, cut down on the reliance on oil from foreign sources, provide greater tax revenue to localities who tax oil production, for example, something that's very important from a state economic security level. And you can see from the numbers on this slide that there's a tremendous amount of economically recoverable oil. One of the issues is getting enough CO2 to do that. CO2 now, for the most part, comes from natural sources to use in enhanced oil recovery, and being able to access CO2 that comes from carbon capture from power sectors or from industrial processes is something that could be very important for this particular industry. And it provides fiscal benefits at a time when federal government and many states face budget challenges. That's one of the cases that's being made with the tax legislation that's being considered in Washington right now, is that because of the extra revenue that's provided from this, revenue that may not be achieved because without using CO2 to recover the oil, that oil may not ever be recovered, or may not be recovered economically, and so being able to access those tax revenues and that oil is something that provides extra benefits for our communities. And again, these are all things that you've probably seen before and are all part of the resolution that NARUC passed back a little while ago, but never hurts to repeat the case for federal and state support for CO2 EOR. And that's what the state working group has been talking about, and what their reports are based on. So with that, let me turn it over to Dan and let him move, as we move to the next slide, let Dan talk about the first report that the group did, which was state and policy drivers putting the puzzle together, policy drivers for America's carbon capture and the CO2 EOR industry. Dan?
Doug. So this is Dan Lloyd, and I work in the Governor's Office of Economic Development in Governor Bullock's office in Montana, and I'm proud to represent Montana on the state CO2 EOR working group. And so I'm going to briefly summarize one of the major work products of this group, this report, Putting the Puzzle Together, State and Federal Policy Drivers for Growing America's Carbon Capture and CO2 EOR Industry. And this report, we released it last December. Really broadly, this report provides the rationale for the capture of CO2 from power plants, excuse me, and industrial facilities, and its use and storage through enhanced oil recovery as a key component of a U.S. and global energy strategy that can provide some of those benefits that Doug touched on: economic, environmental, and national security. The report goes on to make some pretty specific policy recommendations that, if enacted, will result in increased capture of CO2 for enhanced oil recovery. And before I get into the report, I want to just spend a quick minute highlighting some of those benefits that Doug just touched on, and I don't want to belabor the point, but I do think it's really important to providing some context. So Doug mentioned the opportunity for increased domestic oil production and its associated benefits, less reliance on oil from hostile regimes, increased tax revenues for states, reduced trade deficits, job creation. But I think just as important as job creation, and really especially for a state like Montana, it's the opportunities for job retention that extend far beyond just the oil field, and they touch on a number of industries. So we're talking about creating and especially, as I said, retaining jobs in the manufacture and installation of the equipment that's going to be used for carbon capture in new pipelines, at existing coal-fired power plants and other carbon-emitting industrial facilities. You have research and development jobs in new technologies, and then the countless other industries that rely on our strong and stable oil industry. So as I'll get into in more detail, CO2 EOR provides an incredible opportunity for cost-effective carbon sequestration, and it really creates the opportunity to provide a level playing field for low carbon energy. And some of these policies that I'll get into really provide an incentive and a market for CO2 that's currently just going into the air. And as I just kind of briefly touched on, a lesser appreciated but really important benefit to CO2 EOR is that you're protecting and enhancing not only jobs, but the value of our existing assets. In Montana and Wyoming alone, Matt, who's speaking after me, can appreciate this. Billions of dollars have been invested in these assets that are at risk due to changing markets and regulatory environments. And CO2 enhanced oil recovery provides a cost-effective way of maintaining and really even increasing the value of these coal-fired facilities and mines, these older oil fields, all of the associated infrastructure, and as I said, of course, those jobs. So recognizing those benefits, the state working group, with the help of private sector stakeholders, including representatives from the enhanced oil recovery industry, electric power, coal, and environmental advocates, undertook a detailed analysis of what policies would really be effective in encouraging further investment in CO2 for enhanced oil recovery. So on to the next slide, please. So the report itself really took a project level financial feasibility analysis and based on that analysis made state and federal policy recommendations that would increase the deployment of carbon capture technologies. Ultimately, the report, this will come as no surprise, it didn't uncover a single silver bullet, but recommends a combination of policies that provide the most effective possibility for moving this industry forward. So from the federal level, our first recommendation was to extend and reform 45Q. And 45Q is an existing tax credit for carbon capture and storage. As the law stands today, firms can receive $10 per ton of CO2 stored as part of an enhanced oil recovery project. but the program is currently capped at a total of 75 million metric tons. Through this report, the group recommended increasing that credit to $30 per ton and removing the cap. There's a few other minor tweaks suggested, but we really think those were kind of the big pieces to help make 45Q more effective. The second recommendation you can see on the slide was to establish contracts for differences for CO2 EOR projects. Currently, the price of CO2 largely tracks the price of oil, so volatile oil prices yield volatile CO2 prices. Contract for differences would allow the federal government to guarantee a set price for CO2 over the term of a contract, decreasing uncertainty and lowering the cost of capital for these projects. And if properly designed and implemented, contracts for difference could be revenue neutral for the Treasury. The third recommendation you can see up there is to allow carbon capture projects to be eligible for both private activity bonds and master limited partnerships. These recommendations, again, would lower the cost of debt and equity for projects with a real modest cost to the Treasury. I should add, the group didn't recommend expanding the allocation of private activity bonds, but simply to make them available to power and industrial facilities that capture and store CO2 emissions. We'll go to the next slide for the state recommendations. So as part of this analysis, we looked at state policies, and I should say that this report, we really only dug into state tax policies, but we did recognize that there are other state policies such as state portfolio requirements, mandatory power purchase or offtake agreements for facilities that capture carbon would also have a huge impact. In addition, regulatory policies that deal with CO2 storage, project development, pipeline transport, they're also very important policies from a state level for facilitating increased carbon capture and utilization, but we really focused on taxes for this report. And you can see on the slide, the report digs into the effects of sales tax and property tax, as well as production and severance taxes for oil and gas production. And in that bottom box there, you can see our analysis estimated about an $8 per barrel of oil impact that could be realized through targeted state tax policies. And the report itself provides a detailed analysis of the impacts of each of these individual policies at a state level. And I would encourage any of you that are interested to take a look at the report. It's available at www.betterenergy.org/EOR. And that page includes not only the full report, but we have 5 pretty detailed appendices that accompany the report. They include a review of state-level regulatory authorities for carbon capture and sequestration, state-level rules for CO2 storage and transportation, as well as state-level financial incentives. So a lot of good information there. We'll move to the next slide. This is really kind of a summary slide for the report, and already kind of touched on some of these at a high level, but really to reiterate, our analysis indicates that CO2 EOR warrants state and federal policies to support this industry as part of a cost-effective carbon mitigation strategy. And the working group believes that the recommendations laid out in the report really provide a balanced and cost-effective approach to reducing carbon emissions. As you can see from the graph on the right, at an estimated $66 per ton, carbon capture and enhanced oil recovery at a coal-fired power plant lands pretty much in the middle of the cost curve compared to a number of other low and no carbon power generation options. With some targeted policy changes, the working group believes that we can realize the benefits of increased carbon capture and use in enhanced oil recovery. And just kind of in closing, we know that carbon capture at existing coal plants can work. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the Petra plant near Houston. You know, the conditions were really right for that project, and we're hoping that through some targeted policy changes, we can create those situations in more places throughout the country to really realize all of these benefits. And coming from a state that has vast coal resources, existing coal-fired assets, this issue is vitally important to me, and I really appreciate you guys taking the time to better understand the issues, and would encourage you to take a look at that report at betterenergy.org/EOR. And with that, I'll turn it over to Matt to talk about the working group's research and recommendations on pipeline development.
Thanks, Dan. Morning, everybody. I hope you can hear me well enough. If not, obviously somebody should let me know. But anyway, just to follow along with our discussion this morning, I'm going to talk a little bit about the work group's focus on CO2 pipeline infrastructure. So as we talked through things and worked through the working group, it was pretty apparent that there's a significant lack of infrastructure needed to transport CO2. As a result of that, the work group decided that we develop a second report that describes implementable actions that'll help expand the CO2 EOR market. So with that, in February, the work group released this report, which is 21st Century Energy Infrastructure Policy Recommendations for Development of American CO2 Pipeline Networks. It's a fairly short report, but a lot of good information in there that we think will help benefit the infrastructure market and people that are looking to actually build pipelines to expand this market. So just run through these bullet points real quick. One of the primary recommendations was to call on the Trump administration and Congress to make CO2 pipelines a priority in their national infrastructure agenda. Obviously, infrastructure agenda is big in this administration, and what we're doing aligns significantly with what they're proposing. But with this recommendation, we just wanted to bring CO2 pipelines specifically up in the conversation so that they get a better seat at the table when all of these things are being discussed in D.C. Next recommendation was for federal role to supplement private capital and financing, increase capacity for large volume, long distance trunk CO2 pipelines, and that is a bit of a tongue twister. So as we state in the parentheses here, there's tremendous benefits for supersizing trunk CO2 pipelines, and we wanted to bring forward the opportunity for the government to help us make this a reality just because of the economies of scale associated with it. Last bullet on this slide was we wanted to urge the administration to have a more coordinated approach to planning and permitting these pipelines. Based specifically on some of the work I'm doing here in Wyoming, which I'll talk about here in a minute, we felt that it would be it would be very beneficial for a more proactive and coordinated effort to essentially efficiently site these and build these pipeline projects. So if there's a coordinated effort amongst all of these entities, you can save yourself a lot of work in the back end of a project. Next slide, please. This slide is merely just a graphic to kind of describe the tremendous opportunities that are available to capture CO2 and then transport it to EOR fields, and then finally utilize it in production of oil with the eventual sequestration of the CO2. Obviously, those large arrows are not very fine scaled, and we did that on purpose. We didn't want anybody to think that we were actually citing anything. These are just opportunities to take CO2 from source to sink. Next slide, please. And building on that last slide, you saw those 5 arrows. What we're looking at here is the work group is recommending that 5 major CO2 pipeline corridors be developed so that we can establish very large CO2 pipelines. That would be a tremendous asset to the nation, as it would significantly increase the opportunities for capture and transportation of CO2. And there's a lot of benefits to that. I won't read through all of those, as you see in there in the bullet point, but essentially what these 5 CO2 pipelines would do for us would allow for significant increases in oil production, capture of CO2, and then, as Doug talked about a lot in the beginning, there's all sorts of jobs and financial benefits associated with this. So just a general discussion about the pipeline report as it kind of relates to Wyoming. Obviously, Wyoming is an energy state, so we're tremendously supportive of all the recommendations put forward by the work group. The pipeline recommendations themselves are of particular interest. They strongly align with and bolster a project which I'm managing for the governor to administratively authorize a 2,000-mile statewide pipeline corridor system focused on CO2 EOR. So if these recommendations of the working group are implemented and the corridor system that I'm working on is authorized, Wyoming alone would have the opportunity to produce about 2 billion barrels of oil while sequestering 20 trillion cubic feet of CO2. So obviously that's pretty important for us, both financially and for our assets in the state. And if you look at that, as Doug talked about significantly in the beginning, if you expand that to a national level, there's a tremendous opportunity for energy, income, jobs, and environmental benefits associated with this. So with that, I will pass it on to Sean and be happy to try to answer any questions at the end.
Thank you, sir. As Doug mentioned earlier, my name is Sean Sheridan. I'm the General Counsel for the Mississippi Public Service Commission. And one of the things that Doug and Brad had asked me to talk about was a utilities regulator's perspective on the working group specifically, but CO2 capture for use in EOR more generally. So I'll start by noting what attracted the Mississippi Commission to this working group. And originally, it was because we were in the midst of looking at or exploring different compliance options for the Federal Clean Power Plan. And so the notion of carbon capture as a potential compliance option was intriguing, at least for 2 reasons. The first of those was we were looking for an opportunity to keep existing coal plants from becoming stranded assets. And this was particularly true with those coal units, those baseload coal units that had been scrubbed. And so if carbon capture or retrofit equipment might be a way of preserving that baseload capacity, we were interested in it. The second thing was Mississippi's involvement with the Kemper Energy Facility, which all or some of you may know is a integrated gasification combined cycle facility that conceptually, at least, attempts to use low-rank coal, produce synthetic gas from it, pull or capture the CO2 pre-combustion from the gas as well as other byproducts, pipe it to an enhanced oil recovery off-taker, and then for use to engage in EOR, and then burn the syngas in the turbines. And so with these ideas in mind, I was instructed to join and take part in the working group. And although the Kemper facility may be seen as a cautionary tale, my enthusiasm for carbon capture and its technologies and its place in the future really has not diminished. And that's in large part because what I came to discover through my interactions with the working group. So, as it turns out, carbon capture offers more than a reduction of CO2. As we've already heard, it can be used for enhanced oil recovery, which has tremendous benefits relative to domestic oil production and associated economic development. And as Matt mentioned a minute ago, there is the possibility to create a robust national market for carbon and to utilize it in different areas of the country, getting it from those places that have it to those places that need it, again, to enhance the domestic oil production. And all of this I discovered with the expertise that were present within this working group. And so they people came from a variety of backgrounds and industries to participate in this working group. You had experts on EOR, experts from the coal industry, environmental groups, federal officials, and state officials who all saw the benefits in carbon capture technology and its use in enhanced oil recovery. And it eventually led to the reports that were discussed earlier, as well as continuing efforts to bring to reality some of the recommendations in those reports. So why, beyond the benefits, the economic benefits associated with enhanced oil recovery, as a public utility regulator, what is it about carbon capture that's sort of important? I think utility commissioners and public utility commissions are very comfortable being economic regulators. They're looking for the lowest reasonable cost to satisfy the need of the consumers or of the utilities. And so they're accustomed to balancing different elements of the public interest. And I think that carbon capture plays into that public interest. And it's for a variety of reasons. The first is, if carbon capture can be economically deployed, it creates options to preserve fuel diversity, particularly coal and particularly relative to baseload facilities. We're approaching a time when we are seeing less diverse fuel sources than we perhaps have had in a long time, whether it's the shuttering of nuclear facilities, the closing of coal facilities. There is more and more reliance solely on natural gas, and that may not always be a good thing. It is now, but I think there's certainly been much concern voiced in the public utility realm about the decreasing options for fuel diversity, and carbon capture holds an opportunity for us to maintain very important fuel diversity. The second thing is, whatever the environmental benefits may be from removing CO2, and we're certain there are some, having CO2 options or CO2 capture options can also act as a hedge against uncertain future regulation. Again, as another way of protecting the ratepayer from avoiding the stranded assets that could be created by virtue of future unknown federal regulations. And carbon capture and its sale for enhanced oil recovery also produces a stream of byproduct revenue that can ultimately reduce the cost to the ratepayers while at the same time improving economic development within the state. And so all of these reasons, I think, are right within the wheelhouse of public utility commissions as they look at, or may in the future have an opportunity to consider, carbon capture technologies. So then how do you get there? How do you find these projects in front of public utility commissioners? And I think one of the things to do is consider prompting the utilities within your jurisdiction to consider carbon capture technologies within their IRP processes. They may or may not be ready yet, but if they're thinking about them now, that at least starts moving the ball down the road. Also, we've heard about the need for incentives and for reduction in price risk to promote financing. And each of the speakers talked earlier about things that were going on both at the federal level and the state level that could be used to help make CO2 technology, CO2 capture technology more readily available. But there's also the possibility for utility commissioners to look for opportunities to pair public utilities with gas and oil producers to engage in joint projects that perhaps could be rate-based, offering another level of security for financing and making some of these projects more of a realization. You have to be cautious about some of that. If you look at the overreach in the Kemper context, that's a rate-based item. It made a lot of what has been attempted possible, but using the rate base as a way to promote some of these smaller projects or technologies in the right scenarios is one way to help get projects like this going. And so, Kira, if you could go to the last slide, please. Well, maybe we skipped the last slide, or maybe I went too far. But what I was getting at was some of the next steps for the work group itself. Yeah, there they are. and I don't need to read them all, but to recap, there are things currently going on at both the federal and state level. 2 reports have already been produced. Members of the working groups are right now lobbying our federal representatives to pay close attention to 45Q legislation, and we're beginning to put in front of state and federal legislatures plans and opportunities to expand the CO2 pipelines. And then we have the possibility of public utility commissioners considering things directly in front of them. And the work group in particular is beginning to create a menu of federal CO2 pipeline financing options so that Congress can consider. Also producing a white paper on the regional RTO and ISO model to see how we could have mixture of equitable treatment for carbon capture facilities. And then we'll have continuing expansion efforts to communicate the work group's priorities to the state and federal policymakers as well as media. And with that, I think I'll turn it back over to Doug to finish it up.
All righty. Thanks, Sean. Thanks, Dan. And thanks, Matt. Ready to take any questions that you might have, and look forward to them. I don't know, Kira, that has to, if there's a special process for that, or you want to jump in here?
Sure. So if folks have questions, let me go to the last slide here. You can click on the little raise hand icon in the GoToWebinar app, and I can call on you so that you can say your question. You can write it into the chat box, or you can email it to me. My email is here on the slide, kzeitelman@naruc.org. Before we get into that, I just wanted to try to give Commissioner Oden a chance to call in.
Sure.
So Commissioner Oden, can you speak right now?
I don't know. Can you hear me?
Yep, we can hear you. Yeah, go ahead. And I apologize for not getting
good.
in at the beginning of the webinar, but yes, please go ahead and give a belated welcome.
That is fine. I think it was probably on my side as well. So we do want to thank y'all for your discussion, and it was an excellent presentation. And that's probably what I wanted to speak on, was what our committee is focused on. We are looking at ways in which clean coal can be used in this country, and the continuation of plants and how they will be accessible in our near future and still keep the backbone going for clean coal, and also what to do with the carbon. And thank you for your discussion on that. So that's where we are heading as a committee, and I appreciate it today. Before we get into the questions, I want to do a little bit of advertisement, Kira, if I can, and that is on the NARUC summer session, policy session. We will continue these discussions and hopefully have great sessions out there. We'll be one on the coal ash issue. It's going to be a heavy discussion on Tuesday. So if anyone interested in that, please check your schedules on NARUC. We've got several things up as the Clean Coal Committee, some on China and the infrastructure that they're doing as well. But I'll get back to this conversation. I don't want to take too much turn on that. But thank you, gentlemen, for your presentations. And Kira, I'll turn it back over to you for the questions.
Great. So I believe Commissioner Johnson has his hand up. So Commissioner, I've unmuted you. You should be able to speak.
Yeah, I really don't have a question other than just to say how impressed I am with the presentation. Doug, Dan, Matt, and Sean did a great job, and look, it was something I was not aware of the group that was looking at this, and so it was very helpful. Thank you very much.
Appreciate it. Thanks.
Thanks. Well, I had a question just to get us started. So some of the commissioners in the Clean Coal Subcommittee were up at the National Energy Technology Laboratory last week speaking to some researchers there about the work that they're doing that's related to carbon capture and enhanced oil recovery. And a question that some of the commissioners had for the researchers was on, kind of the difficulties with siting any sort of infrastructure, including pipelines for carbon dioxide. So can you all talk a little bit about what the public perception is? I know we kind of hear about there's sort of alliances between environmentalists and between industry and regulators in very coal-dependent states. But could you talk a little bit about public perception as well as the sort of reception that you're getting from Congress and the administration on CO2 EOR.
Matt, do you want to start with the siting piece of it, and I can talk about the congressional part if you want.
Sure. It's going to vary. The siting piece is going to vary from state to state. We've obviously seen the issues in Dakotas with the oil pipeline, but speaking from a Wyoming-centric perspective here, I wish I had a slide up to describe it, but Wyoming is literally covered in pipelines just based on our oil and gas activity here. So in Wyoming, generally, pipelines are not an overly contentious issue, unlike overhead transmission lines, obviously. But yeah, pipelines are not typically that contentious. Our proposal and our perspective is that we follow existing infrastructure because we know it's been there and there's less issues with it. From an environmental perspective, in this instance, we're talking specifically about CO2, which is fairly benign. If it were to rupture, it creates a big block ice typically, so unlike an oil spill or something like that. So from our perspective, CO2 and pipelines are less of an issue than the overhead stuff. There will always be the challenges with coordinating with other entities, particularly, we've seen the tribal issues, and in Wyoming with our effort for a CO2 corridor, we're anticipating consulting with tribal entities to work on that issue up front, but just generally it's a lesser issue than overhead.
Either the other state reps, Sean or Dan, did you want to weigh in on that?
Sure, this is Sean. I tend to agree with the observation about pipelines not being as contentious as overhead activity, like with transmission lines. Also, the CO2 being benign, like wind, for example, I don't think there's a problem there. I'd make a note about eminent domain. I think that, for any large pipeline to really be done economically and efficiently, that pipeline would need to be deemed a common carrier and have available to it the authority to exercise eminent domain. But yeah, beyond the normal stuff with landowners, some landowners just not wanting public projects to run across their land, I would not think that CO2 pipe would be as big of a problem, say, as even a DC wind line running through a state.
Dan, anything?
A lot. I guess one thing I would say is Montana's legislature, I believe it was in 2009, established common carrier status for CO2 pipelines. So it's something that our legislature has taken up, and I can say that in general, I guess I would just echo the comments from Sean and Matt that it's been an area where folks that have traditionally been at odds have been able to find some consensus in supporting CO2 pipeline infrastructure.
In terms of the congressional support for the measures that were brought up earlier in the webinar, there's been a bill introduced that deals with the master limited partnership aspect that was discussed earlier, and then the 45Q, the tax credit bill, is something that was introduced last year by both the House and Senate in really a bipartisan fashion. And although it didn't move last year, a lot of good discussion about that, and a lot of discussion about whether to include it in some of the end of session measures, or even at the measure that was just passed for the continued funding of the government through the fall of this year. But in addition to that, now the 45Q, there's a separate bill that's being introduced, that will be introduced in the Senate. A large number of co-sponsors. We don't want to say who those are until it actually gets introduced, but I think you'll find the same really strong bipartisan support for that legislation that we saw in the sponsorships last year. And just to give you an idea of kind of the breadth of the support for that, and kind of an unusual thing for Washington these days, last year's bill was supported by Senate Majority Leader McConnell, as well as Senator Booker and White House. So just to give you an idea of the range of folks that are supporting this legislation. And I think it's also important that you had folks supporting it who are not from oil and gas producing states, but that see this as a really nice piece in an overall energy strategy, even if it doesn't directly impact their states as much as it does in some others. Any other questions?
I do have one more question while folks are still thinking. So you had mentioned the federal price stabilization contracts to kind of shield investors from oil price volatility, but is there any action at either the state commission level or the state legislative level that could shield ratepayers from oil price volatility, or is that just kind of a federal action that that your group is calling for?
This is Doug. I'll start, and if anybody wants to join, it's more of a federal action because the oil prices themselves are generally not a function of individual state governments. So what's typically called kind of price stabilization or contract for differences, which was what was discussed earlier on, would be something, and hopefully that's something that that Secretary Perry and DOE would be something that they could support as well. That would be a nice first step, I think, for this process, getting this recognized that as a way to do this without costing the Treasury a great deal, but something that could really be helpful in getting these projects financed. I don't know if you guys want to add anything to that. Okay.
Commissioner Oden had one more question. Commissioner, you should be unmuted, so can you go ahead and say your question?
Okay. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yes.
Okay, good. I know you talked about the 13 or the 14 states that were involved. How does your state get involved if they are not one of the participating in your group? Is it a legislative action, a PUC action, PSC action? How do you get involved in the discussion?
Thank you, Commissioner. This is Doug from Great Plains again. It could be any of those. We don't. If a state wants to participate with us, whether that's at the PUC level, whether governor's office wants to participate, as you've seen from some of the folks here, it could be somebody who works in the oil and gas portion of the government. It could be a state geological survey. It really doesn't matter to us. It's more trying to get as much state involvement as we can. So I believe, well, if not, I'll give it to you. Our email is, my email is dscott, D-S-C-O-T-T, at gpisd.net. So dscott@gpisd.net, and folks can just send me an email that says that they're interested in participating, and we'd love to talk with anybody about it. And like I say, it could be a commission level, it could be a state environmental agency, could be a governor's office, state energy office. Really doesn't matter. We're happy to have more state participation.
Great, thank you.
And this is Sean. I'll add to what Doug was saying. I think that broad variety of the different participants is one of the strengths of the working group. I know I've really learned a lot by interacting with my colleagues on the working group. And at least for Mississippi's part, the PSC got involved and first participated in the work group, but I keep in contact with the governor's office and with the Department of Environmental Quality, both which express interest in the goings-on of the group. So it's been a great experience, I think, by virtue of the diversity.
Thanks, Sean.
All right, if anyone else has questions, I think this will kind of be the last call. In the meantime, just another quick one from me is, do you all know at Great Plains, or is there some other organization that is kind of tracking CO2 EOR projects like that are either in the pipeline or have started operating, like Petra Nova?
Sure, we are, and this is Doug from Great Plains. We are, and I mentioned the National Enhanced Oil Recovery Initiative. That group is a large stakeholder group that's made up of folks who have touch this industry in a number of ways, and so that would be another great way to get involved with that as well. But you can do that, access that through Great Plains as well.
Mm-hmm.
Kira, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hey, Brad.
Hi, this is Brad Crabtree at the Great Plains Institute as well. I also just wanted to mention that the Global Carbon Capture and Storage Institute does maintain a public database on their website of commercial scale carbon capture projects. And so if whether it was Petra Nova or another project, if you're interested in it, you can go to their website and their database, and they try to maintain fairly updated narrative descriptions of the projects and different factual information and associated with them. So that's another resource for the commissioners and their staff.
Thanks, Brad.
Mm-hmm.
All right, well, seeing as it is about 4 minutes till the top of the hour, I'm not seeing any more questions, so I think I will go ahead and wrap up. I'd just like to say thank you to all of our panelists again. We will, I know I have read the couple of reports that you all have put out through the working group, and I found them really informative, and they're brief. They're not too long, so I appreciate that as well. So I'm looking forward to the next one, and thank you very much. And thank you for everyone for attending.
Thanks, Kira. Appreciate it. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Kira.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.